At first, nothing dramatic happens. No fight, no betrayal, no final message. You simply stop texting first. That is all. You do not announce it. You do not block anyone. You do not decide the friendship is over. You just want to see what happens if you stop being the person who keeps it moving. 1 day passes, then 3, then a week. You look at the chat. Nothing. You tell yourself everyone is busy. Another week. Still nothing. And then comes the uncomfortable realization. You did not stop a friendship. You stopped maintaining one. That difference can change how a person sees every relationship in their life. Because some friendships do not end when something breaks. They end when the person who is carrying the weight finally puts it down. This is one of the quietest psychological shifts of adulthood. Then life changes. People move, schedules separate, careers and families absorb time, and the accidental structure disappears. Suddenly, friendship requires intention. This is where some people discover something they never noticed before. They were the someone. The friendship did not feel one-sided because they were compensating for the imbalance. Then they stopped, and silence exposed the architecture. This is the central metaphor. Friendship is like a fire you assumed both people were feeding. That does not always mean the other person never cared, but it can reveal who was doing the work required to keep the relationship visible. And that discovery can create a very specific kind of grief. An absence is difficult because it leaves room for interpretation. For some people, this is the beginning of a smaller social circle. But shrinking circles are often described too simply. People say adults become more selective. That is true, but selectivity is not only about judging other people. Sometimes it is about becoming aware of limited emotional bandwidth. Time changes value as people age. And when time becomes expensive, people begin noticing what happens after they spend it. This is where emotional selectivity becomes real. The person stops asking, "Have we known each other a long time?" and starts asking, "What does this relationship actually feel like now?" That question can be brutal because history has enormous emotional power. A friendship may contain 10 years of memories and almost no present-day compatibility, but the past is not the same thing as the present. A relationship can be real, important, and finished. That idea is difficult because people often imagine successful relationships as permanent ones. If the friendship ended, something must have failed. But not everything meaningful is meant to remain unchanged forever. Some relationships belong to a version of the self that no longer exists. There is another psychological shift that happens when a person stops maintaining every connection out of guilt. They begin to notice the difference between being known and being remembered. Some people remember your history, but no longer know your present. They know the old version of you, the one who wanted different things, tolerated different dynamics, and occupied a different role in the group. Being around them can create a strange form of identity lag. You are physically in the present, but socially being pulled backward. The jokes are the same, the expectations are the same, the role assigned to you is the same. And after enough time, the relationship can begin to feel less like connection and more like reenactment. That does not make the other person bad. It means the friendship stopped updating while the people inside it kept changing. Some shrinking circles are really the result of refusing to keep performing an outdated self just to preserve continuity. This is another reason circles shrink. Identity evolves. A person changes priorities, and the person may experience guilt because the other person has done nothing wrong. There is no event they can point to, only distance. This is where many people make a mistake. They search for a moral explanation when the psychological explanation is simpler. Nobody betrayed anyone. The identities diverged. The friendship was built around overlap. The overlap disappeared. And because humans are sentimental, they often keep trying to resurrect the old chemistry. Because nostalgia can recreate familiarity without recreating connection. The memories are still alive. The relationship is not necessarily alive in the same way. That distinction hurts. But there is another kind of shrinking circle that has nothing to do with incompatibility. It is simply mathematics. Close relationships require time, and attention is finite. Every close relationship occupies mental space. That depth cannot be spread infinitely. At some point, adding more relationships reduces the attention available to existing ones. So adulthood often forces a choice: broad connection or deep connection. Neither is automatically better. But many people eventually discover they prefer fewer relationships with more psychological presence. This is also why a large social circle can sometimes hide loneliness better than a small one. A person may have dozens of chats, invitations, reactions, and people who know their name, yet very few places where they can arrive without performing. Social abundance is not the same thing as emotional access. You can be constantly contacted and rarely understood. You can be invited everywhere and still feel that nobody would notice if you stopped being useful, funny, agreeable, or available. When the circle shrinks, some of that noise disappears. What remains becomes easier to evaluate. Who asks questions after the first answer? Who notices when your tone changes? Who can tolerate silence without trying to fill it? Who remains interested when there is no crisis, event, or entertainment attached? Depth becomes easier to see when quantity stops creating camouflage. This is why a small circle can feel more emotionally rich than a large one. The number decreases, the depth increases. But here is the part that complicates the flattering version. A shrinking circle is not automatically maturity. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is avoidance. A person can call themselves selective when they are actually becoming increasingly intolerant of vulnerability. They can say they are protecting their energy when they are afraid of disappointment. They can call every difficult friendship draining because they no longer want to tolerate the ordinary friction required by closeness. This is the midpoint reversal. There is a difference between filtering relationships and slowly removing every relationship capable of making demands. Real friendship is not permanently effortless. If every imbalance is treated as proof that the relationship was fake, selectivity becomes a very lonely form of perfectionism. This is why the experiment of, "I will stop texting and see who reaches out," can reveal something useful, but it can also mislead. The deeper pattern matters more than one test. Reciprocity is not perfect symmetry. Healthy relationships breathe. Sometimes one person carries more, then the weight shifts. The problem begins when the weight never shifts back. That is when exhaustion turns into clarity. Some friendships survive. Those people notice, they reach out, they ask what happened, they restore contact. Others vanish, and the person discovers something almost embarrassing. They were not losing a relationship now, they had been preventing the loss for years. This can change the way they approach friendship entirely. They stop measuring closeness by history. They stop confusing availability with loyalty. They stop assuming that being needed means being valued. That last one matters. Some people build entire social identities around usefulness. Being useful creates constant contact, and constant contact can look like intimacy. Then the person stops solving problems for everyone. The phone becomes quieter, and they are forced to ask a painful question. Did these people love my presence, or did they love my function? Sometimes the answer is reassuring, sometimes it is not. The difficult part is that healthier friendship does not always feel more exciting. Drama creates intensity, and intensity is easy to confuse with closeness. A friendship built on constant emergencies, gossip, rescuing, conflict, or emotional dependence can feel extremely bonded because the nervous system is activated so often. A quieter friendship may feel less consuming simply because it is safer. There is less to fix, less to interpret, less fear that one wrong move will change everything. People sometimes leave stable relationships feeling almost underwhelmed because they were trained to recognize emotional volatility as evidence that something important is happening. A shrinking circle can therefore involve learning to value steadiness over intensity. The friendship that survives may be the one that produces fewer dramatic stories, but more trust. This is where smaller circles can become psychologically healthier. Not because fewer people are inherently better, but because the remaining relationships survive the disappearance of performance. That may be the real reason some people stop feeling guilty when old friendships fade. They are no longer evaluating relationships by how long they have existed. They are evaluating them by how much of the current self can exist inside them. But this does not erase grief. Maturity is not emotional indifference. Sometimes it is the ability to let something end without rewriting it as meaningless. The friendship mattered. It shaped you. It gave you memories. And it still may not belong in your present. That is one of adulthood's hardest forms of honesty. Now return to the phone from the beginning. You stopped texting first. Days passed, then weeks. Some names disappeared completely, but not all of them. And suddenly the experiment revealed something more nuanced than who cares and who does not. It revealed where the relationship had its own momentum. Which connections could move without you pushing them? Which people noticed your absence rather than only your usefulness? and which friendships were already memories being kept alive through effort. That is why social circles often shrink, not because people become cold, not because adulthood destroys friendship, and not because every disappearing relationship was secretly toxic. Sometimes people simply stop maintaining connections that no longer move in both directions. They stop dragging the past into the future out of guilt. They stop spreading themselves so thin that nobody receives the full version of them. And they begin to understand that connection is not measured by how many people can reach you. It is measured by how many relationships remain alive when you stop performing the work of keeping them alive alone. A smaller circle can be a loss. It can also be a correction. The real question is not how many people left. It is what remained when you finally put the weight down.